Good afternoon. Okay. So I have the great pleasure to introduce Joan Countryman, and she's truly a pioneer. She realized early on that students needed to write in mathematics. Okay? And she did this at a time when, in the field of mathematics, when very few were writing in mathematics. Well, very few were even talking in mathematics classrooms, for that matter. And she realized that how important it was to write, and it was at a high school level on top of it, okay? So she ventured out there. And when asked why did you do that? And she said, it made sense. There's so much to gain from doing it, okay? Yeah, she could be heard at NCTM in those early days, and she was one of few people talking about writing. You know? And people were saying, there's no time to write. There's so much content to be covered at the high school level. You know, there's no time to talk even, okay? So she really broke new ground for us. And she even wrote a publication, and it's called Writing to Learn Mathematics. And I love a paragraph in there. To learn mathematics, students must construct it for themselves. They can only do that by exploring, justifying, representing, discussing, using, describing, investigating, and predicting. Interesting, isn't it? Because we've heard make a hypothesis, making conjectures. So Joan had that idea early on about the importance of the predictions, and then having students organize their own knowledge and pull it together to make meaning. Okay. But Joan has also been in Providence, Rhode Island. She had a position as former head of Lincoln Schools. Okay. She went on to Oprah Winfrey, asked her to be the interim head of the Leadership Academy of for girls in South Africa. When she asked Oprah, so what do you want? Oprah just said, you. Isn't that a nice story to tell? So she was free to kind of pull the ideas together, organize the group, you know, get teachers in this mode of thinking about writing and mathematics, thinking and talking and so forth. Okay. So she's been a busy lady, let's say. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Joan Countryman.
I'm hooked up, I think, so thanks. Well, I'm not sure about Oprah stories. I might tell some, but it's very exciting for me to join you in this conversation. I feel it hadn't occurred to me until I talked to a few people just during lunch and just before I came over here to say, I know that one of the problems, those of us who are interested in math and writing, one of the problems we have is that my Writing to Learn Mathematics, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that came about, but is one of the few books around, and I can see a lot of heads nodding. So we're going to solve that problem because you could write a few, right? And my advice is to collect student work, and pretty soon you're going to have a huge box full of it, and it will give you something, as you heard this morning, to work with. And we do need that. Looking back at Writing to Learn Mathematics, which I wrote, I started teaching high school math, middle and high school math in 1970. There are a lot of people who might not even have been born then in this room. I started in 1970, and I collected stuff from student work from the beginning, and I published that book, I think it was in the late 80s, and it's still there. You can get it on Amazon or somewhere. It's still available. But when I look at it now, I see a lot of student work that's from another age. So I think we need some more. I'm going to tell you, you'll figure out how old I am. I always end up telling people how old I am, and part of the reason is I talk about things that happened long enough ago that I can see on the faces, how do you know that? But I want to before I even talk directly about math, I'm going to tell you a few things about me, partly inspired by John Edgar Wideman last night, and partly inspired by my train ride here from Philadelphia yesterday. Philadelphia is only an hour away, by the way, on Amtrak, which is an important thing to keep in mind, because these are both Baltimore and Philadelphia, I think wonderful and problematic cities. My mother was born here in Baltimore 101 years ago, and so as the train came in, I just had a flood of memories of stories that she told me about growing up here beginning in 1914 when she was born. In any case, in my recent years, I have been writing poetry a little bit, and I'm going to read you 3 of my poems, which after I heard John Wideman last night, I thought of one of them, and then I discovered there are 3 that I'd like to share. The first one is called Death. When the cats murdered the guinea pigs, my children were 7 and 5. The victims, Cinnamon and Sugar, were visitors from kindergarten spending spring vacation in their cage in our second-floor bathroom of our house in Germantown. It turned out they were easy prey for Billy and Billy, our cats. "Why, Mommy?" the children asked, sitting on either side of me on the edge of my unmade bed. "I love Cinnamon and Sugar," one child said. "I love Billy and Billy too," one said. "We don't know why," I said, "except that this is what cats do." "This is what guinea pigs do," one child said, wrinkling her nose and laughing. And our memorial service for Cinnamon and Sugar there in my room that afternoon prepared them for the deaths of others, a classmate, a college friend, each grandparent. I think of questions for my mother, dead now more than 25 years. "Why, Mom?" I ask. "It's what we do," she said. And the next poem is called August 1963. "We took turns carrying your father in a canvas baby pack. He was not quite 6 months old at the time. Wednesday the 28th was one of those bright, clear summer days in Washington, humid, but truly hot only in direct sun, and that made the reflecting pool even more inviting when we reached it in the afternoon. My parents came along, they said, to help with the baby, knowing better than your grandfather and I the dangers of our national capital. We'd heard the police were braced for trouble. No vacation days, federal troops just outside the district line, but 250,000 marchers showed up for what seemed more a Sunday picnic than dangerous political action. There was a lot of fried chicken and potato salad carried in coolers and served on paper plates because who could count on restaurants serving us? We marched for jobs and freedom, and we sang for justice. We hugged and cried and longed for signs that this rally, this day, this effort would make a difference. We couldn't hear the speeches, but we waved our signs and we stamped our feet and we dreamed of change and then went home. Now, 50 years later, the island of poverty is still crowded in a sea of prosperity. The check we try to cash on the promise of life and liberty comes back marked insufficient funds, every time we send it in. No matter, keep marching. And finally, and this is the one that got me to do this, is a poem called My American Dream. In my dream, I am my mother, or one of her sisters, 4 girls growing up in Baltimore with 2 brothers and 2 working parents, living in a tall house with steep stairs. And in my dream, I am there the day the boys roll a watermelon down the stairs, bump, bump, from 2nd floor to 1st, for want of the knife hidden by their mother. They plan to break the smooth green skin and eat the fruit, red and sweet, that spills on each step. In my dream, I am my mother or one of the aunties. You never know what color will come out, my grandmother said, speaking of the 6 children she and her husband had produced: butterscotch, French vanilla, coffee with cream, chocolate, then cinnamon and creme brulee. In my dream, with my sisters, I drive a car to see the Chesapeake, drink lemonade, eat cotton candy, hot dogs, and ice cream cones. A 3-hour drive to walk on separate sand, the colored beach, and 3 hours back. In my dream, we stop for gas and toilets in Annapolis. Disgusting, my sister says, comes out and marches to the white toilet. The owner yells, "Take one more step and I'll call the cops, you jungle bunny." "Call 'em," she yells back and slams the door. In my dream that night, we float out of jail and back over the bridge to Baltimore. So I'm here to tell you that I'm very moved to be here in Baltimore, and especially this week, this month, this time, because one of my experiences in South Africa, or one of the lessons I learned in South Africa, is their message that we must acknowledge our history. We must keep in mind the mistakes of the past, and then we can move on. And my hope for this city, as well as for my own, is that we are beginning to do that. So when I did workshops, and I did them at NCTM in the olden days, one of the things I always tried to do was have math people write their own math autobiography for me. And I'm not going to do that today, but I will challenge you to think about your math biographies. You're all thinking about that now anyway because of this wonderful conference. What I used to say to my students was, think of your triumphs and think of your disasters. And one of the things I learned right away is that although many of us, I say us advisedly, let me just say, those of you in the room who are math teachers know that there's nothing like going to a cocktail party and having someone say, "What do you do?" And you say, "Oh, I teach math," and they back away, right? Wander off. I know that there are many people for whom the idea of a triumph in mathematics is not on the radar screen, but in fact, there is one for everybody, in my opinion. And most people can tell you many disasters, and I know that as well. But I want to tell you a little bit about my autobiography, and I want to, was nothing good, about my autobiography and how I discovered writing and math. My career in education began in the fall of 1942 when I entered nursery school. I realize now that the school was one of the daycare centers established during World War II to help working parents who were needed for the war effort. The nursery was located on the top floor of the vocational high school where my father, one of the first African-American public high school teachers in Philadelphia, taught mathematics. What I liked best about going to school was riding in the streetcar every morning with my daddy. It was clearly a good start for a brilliant career. By the time I was 5, we were living in the Germantown section of Philadelphia, and I was enrolled in kindergarten at our local public school. One of my favorite pastimes was copying the drawings of geometric figures in my father's math books, a pretend school of sorts. In 2nd grade, my best friend Laverne and I made the mistake of reading ahead in the reader. The teacher's response was to set us dusting the supply closet, a solution that did not sit well with my parents, as you might imagine. In fact, they had a huge argument with the principal, and within a week, I was whisked out of that school, and by the following fall enrolled as a scholarship student in 3rd grade at Germantown Friends School, a nearby Quaker school for grades kindergarten through 12. It was a good match. I loved school. I was one of those children who said things like, "Do you like arithmetic? I love arithmetic." So when I headed off to college in 1958, I announced to anyone, and this is maybe not surprising, I bet some of you have had this experience. I headed off to college in 1958, and I announced to anyone who asked that there were 2 things I was definitely not going to do. One was be a teacher, and the other was live in Philadelphia. So 12 years later, in the fall of 1970, I was teaching mathematics to 10th graders in Philadelphia at Germantown Friends. Before that, I had been working as a program planner for the school district of Philadelphia. So when I got into a classroom, I brought along serious questions about the distance between what one does in school and what one does in life. I especially did not like the isolation of the process of learning mathematics. The convention was that you study it alone, you put your hand over your paper, you take your test alone, and in general, you don't have much to do with other people in the room. In my classroom, right away, I put the kids in groups and I had them teach each other and take tests together. I was determined to get them away from the idea that education was only a private experience. I also wanted them to be less passive. Math is an active process, but you might never know that if you sit and wait for a teacher to tell you what to do. Why should we care about the steps of long division? Well, suppose we wanted to order buses to take all the kids in the school to the baseball game. How many buses do we need? What other questions should we ask? Too often, students think that the teacher has all the information and they don't have any. One afternoon, while students were working on a set of exercises, one boy came to me and said he needed some help. When he showed me his work, I said, "Does your answer make sense?" As the words came out of my mouth, I could see in his eyes that the question had never occurred to him. Make sense? Not on his radar screen. So what was? Is it the right answer? Is it the answer in the back of the book? Will the teacher accept this answer? Those were reasonable questions. The chances were, for him, most of the time, none of it made sense. So I knew I had to find a better approach. So early on, I asked my students to write about what they were doing. And one of my very first ideas was to use a mathematics autobiography. And in that, I discovered that they were all carrying all sorts of stories in their heads, specific memories about classroom experiences. In third grade, when the teacher made me do 100 addition facts over and over, I felt terrible because I couldn't get it right. Here's another quote. In elementary school, I was a very good math student and always found myself working on math level tests much higher than those of my classmates. My teacher pushed me very hard, and I often got private lessons with the teacher while the rest of the class was working on other problems. And still another. My earliest math memory is a failure. In my new school, I didn't know how to multiply, and the rest of the class was doing multiplication problems. I struggled to memorize the tables, but I couldn't understand the concept. So where did Joan, get the idea about writing? First, I want to name and credit some of my own teachers. There were many, but in high school at GFS, Germantown Friends, Bob Boynton, Alice Darnell, David Mallory, and in college, Ed Kogan and Joe Papaleo. All of those people are math and English teachers. They gave me the tools and nurtured in me the confidence of which the mathematician W.W. Sawyer speaks in his writing about education. I think it was Alice Darnell who suggested I be given Sawyer's book, Mathematician's Delight, when I was awarded a math prize in high school. In graduate school, I was lucky enough to study with Professor Sawyer at Wesleyan University. I'm paraphrasing here a bit, but of education, in that book and in others, Professor Sawyer said, the topics and treatment of the syllabus should be determined by the following principles. A, the courses must be enjoyable and generate steadily increasing enthusiasm for the pupils. B, they should develop independence and activity of mind, curiosity, observation, and confidence. And 3, they should make pupils familiar with the basic ideas and processes of the disciplines. Armed with that vision, I entered teaching confident that I could find ways to invite students to embrace the discipline of mathematics with enthusiasm, and that writing to learn would help. Here is Professor Sawyer once more. The essential quality for a mathematician is the habit of thinking things out for oneself. That habit is usually acquired in childhood. It's hard to acquire later. Complete success in our work would mean that every individual felt, I enjoyed the mathematics that I had time to learn. If I ever need or want to learn some more, I shall not be afraid to do so. Now, if you've read about me in William Zinzer's book, Writing to Learn, you may remember that after reading an excerpt in the New York Times Quarterly Education Life, I wrote to Bill Zinzer, and I told him the following. I said, for many years, I've been asking my students to write about mathematics as they learned it, with predictably wonderful results. Writing seems to free them of the idea that math is a collection of right answers owned by the teacher, a body of knowledge that she will dispense in chunks and that they have to swallow and digest. Bill Zinzer called me a humanist in the world of fractions and cosines. And when he asked me, what is mathematics, I said that mathematics gives us ways of making sense of the world. I showed him some examples of student writing. With 7th graders, I would pose a problem start a discussion, and then ask students to write about the discussion using the format: 1, describe the problem; 2, discuss your approach; and 3, explain what you found out. Now, one of the ways that they would do that is to write letters to their friends. And I'll read you a letter from this 7th grade problem. This is from Francis. Dear Jim, in math class, we had a problem which was to find a number that had 13 factors. At first, we tried it by guessing, but it seemed hopeless. Then we made a list which included squares of numbers up to 20 and the factors of the numbers. And at the end, we counted the factors. From that, we saw that the squares that had 3 factors had square roots that were prime. Then we made a list, like this one, and he has a list. From that list, we saw that when the numbers were doubled, we noticed a consecutive sequence starting from 2 in this column that showed the number of factors. Proceeding with that logic, Francis needed only a few more sentences to tell Jim how he found the missing number. Now, if you think about it, and it occurs to me that we might, in another situation, I'm not going to take the time to do it, but we might play around with a problem like that or another one, because it is interesting to see that child, that's a 7th grader talking there, and what he's done is summarize the experience he had with making this list. What actually happened in the classroom was a lot of arguing and struggling and making lists and changing their minds and trying something else. But in the end, the opportunity to write down what they had found and to put it in some logical way was the easiest way that I could think of to help them both summarize and also acknowledge that they had moved from a beginning, as he said, we thought it was impossible, to seeing that, in fact, with some mathematical tools, they will be able to answer a question like that. So I want to talk about well, let me hold off on that one. I have a couple more examples, but I think at this point I'd like to begin to hear from you about some of the questions or observations you've had about this notion of using math in writing. I would certainly underscore that the journey that I took was the journey, if you will, of a pioneer, a person who was in fact making it up as she went along, because I was searching for a way to get out of this notion that the teacher had all the answers and the kid just needed to copy what I said, because I knew that had never worked for me, and I expected that it wouldn't work for my students. But I have to credit certainly the National Writing Project folks, and there are lots of people in this beginning for me in the 70s and 80s who were talking about the usefulness of writing, but there wasn't anybody talking much about writing in math. A few in the sciences, and certainly there was, that was one of the places I looked for help with what I wanted to do. But it's only, I think, fairly recently that more and more effort has gone, as we've seen yesterday and today, into not only to asserting the usefulness of writing in mathematics, but also describing some of the ways we could structure our work so that we are confident that the students are moving in a direction that we hope they will. So let me stop for a minute and hear from you.
So, no switch? Not on. I'll use
Yeah.
the cafeteria voice. How's
There
that?
you go.
So congratulations, and I think that, you know, your work speaks for itself, and it sounds like you were a pioneer. I'm curious about a community of teachers and leaders who support this work. What's been your experience that you can share with us? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I did have a community, and the first community I had was in my own school. I was the only math teacher saying this stuff, and some of you are having that experience, I know. But there were others who were looking for ways to engage students, and part of the engagement in the early 70s was around group work. And as I said, my interest in that came out of this. Actually, I can tell you exactly where it came from. My first real job was it was in the school district of Philadelphia. There was a new superintendent. He hired a group, he set up a planning office. The school district had never had a planning office, and one of the reasons they had it was that they were using school buildings, many of which had been built in the 1880s and 90s, and this was in the 1960s. And so they decided they needed some new construction, and then they thought we should think about the program that goes on in these buildings. So I was part of the educational planning team. I was 27 years old. I had been to graduate school. I had studied a lot of ideas about teaching mathematics, but also education in general. I was very involved in the civil rights movement, and urban education was my great passion. So there I was, lucky enough to be in this team, and all the other people were well educated too. And we were given projects to work on, and we didn't have a clue how to work together. We struggled with just figuring out how do you take a task like designing a new curriculum for West Philadelphia High School or something like that. How do you begin even to talk about that? We had some triumphs and we had some disasters, but when I then decided it was time for me to, actually what I decided was that I was becoming an expert in education, but I had only been minimally in the classroom, and it was time for me to put myself in there. So, and that's how I ended up back in the classroom. I was hungry to be with kids and having the give and take of challenging students to embrace learning in the way that I believed that they could and should. So that's what put me back in the classroom. But again, I had this sense that with all the extraordinary opportunities I hadn't had much in the way of experience of collaborative work, of how to help people develop the skills so that they could hear each other and work with each other and support each other and so forth. So that was my interest. So in my school, there were a couple of other teachers who were saying the same thing, and we didn't have professional development in that wonderful school either, but we made it up. We said, well, why don't we meet once a week together, and we called it the Tuesday group, because that's when we could all come, and we had snacks in the afternoon, and we shared with each other our ideas. And that went on for a couple of years among the mostly younger teachers in the school. But that's, for me, was the beginning of what I thought might happen in a school. Later, and one of the reasons some of you know about in addition to the book and stuff, one of the reasons that all happened was that the Woodrow Wilson Foundation funded the summer institutes for initially for math and science teachers. I was selected to do that one summer. We went off to Princeton for 4 weeks. And there was one of those moments that we were having a discussion with one of the experts, and somebody asked a question about how do you get, this is a focus on pre-calculus in the high school math curriculum. And one of the participants, we were all high school teachers from all over the country. One of the participants said, you know, I'm struggling with how to get kids to really think about what they're doing. And so then I raised my hand and I said, I know how you can do that. You should get them to write about it. Well, they all thought that was a little nutty. Well, at least I thought they thought it was nutty. But the next thing I found out was that the Woodrow Wilson Foundation had planned to select 4 people from the 50 of us who were in this group. I think it was 50, and that they would put us on the road the next summer. So lo and behold, I got picked because I said that thing about writing. And for 4 years, every summer, I went all over the country working with groups of high school teachers on week-long workshops on the math curriculum, and my job was to talk to them about using writing. So that whole experience, I mean, I am a person who believes that we can make change, and I think my experience coming out of the civil rights movement in particular, that, you know, the younger people say to me, oh, well, you guys knew what to do. We had some ideas, but a lot of the time we were just floundering about, but convinced that we did live in a society where we could make a difference, and that's what we should try to do. By the way, I promised myself and some others that I would tell you this. My father was a math teacher, I told you that. My sister teaches, my 2 children are teachers, their spouses are teachers, and in September, my first grandchild, who is now 22 years old and a senior in college, will start her career as a history teacher in the high school level. So it is the family business, which we didn't enter for the compensation, as you all well know. But there is, I'm very proud of the fact that we are, I do have to make one more political statement. I don't think our democracy will survive unless we figure out how to provide access to excellent education in our public systems for every kid in the country. I think we can do that, and I think we can do it if we believe in it. But we need to believe that that's possible. So whatever we are doing, and some of my family are involved in private education and some in public, but our commitment is to making access available to everyone. Okay, that's mine.
Thank you, Joan. We probably have time for one more question. There's one.
So you raised earlier the issue about time in the classroom, and we believe writing is crucial in all subject areas, but as a member of the math team, I'm passionate about writing in mathematics. What's the best argument you've come up with for teachers that writing should be taking place in classroom subjects outside of English language arts?
You know, first of all, time is a funny question to ask, because raise your hand if you're absolutely convinced that every minute of the day in your class, not the math, I know it is important, but how we spend time, you know, is I think certainly we can debate about how much of it is or when it happens. I'm convinced, for example, in mathematics that, you know, some of what we do in Algebra 1, if I can engage you, if I can get your attention, 13-year-old or whatever age you are, I could probably help you either learn or have access to what you need to know in algebra, right? And it might only take a couple of weeks. But what we do is spend a whole year often going over and over and over these things because I haven't engaged you. So my main argument that I could make in different ways is that the point is not even to teach writing, it's not to teach math, or it's not to teach anything. It's to teach a love of learning and the fact that you can, in fact, do these things yourself. So I've always felt as a teacher that my job was to find out what it is you care about first, right? And that's true for a 6-year-old or for an adult learner. I'm trying to get in touch with your interests and passions because then I can show you ways in which you can use those to figure out how to do trigonometry or whatever. I want to make one other, I want to read you something. I love Facebook, not because I love Facebook, but because my son, my 52-year-old professor's son, said to me, Mom, you should get on Facebook because all your students are asking about you. So I did. And so since then, I've been hearing from students from all over the world and at different ages. And here's a message I got not too long ago. Hi, Joan. I doubt you remember every one of thousands of students, but I never thanked you for kindling my respect for the language of math. I never got much beyond second level algebra, but to this day I am awed and fascinated by the myriad ways math seems to arise in my day-to-day life. But more importantly, I will never forget how you stood up for a very shy, insecure me when you chastised fellow students for calling me stupid. It went a long way, long way in making me more sure of my intellect and abilities. So thank you. He's a photographer, and his photographs are extraordinary, and they just tell me all the math that's in his head by their beauty. So that's why I teach. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much. Thank you.